Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this special session of dtalks, disruptive talks on education, and I'm your host, Mashood. We continue to bring to you some extraordinary people, ideas, stories, and organizations that are disrupting the status quo, not just in education but also in other areas of social impact. And the idea of of social impact, the one big challenge which all organizations are trying to crack is to how to have this one good idea and scale it on a very large platform. Because what we see that ideas that sometimes work on a small scale may or may not work on a very large scale. So what are the determinants that really drive an idea to work good on a large scale is something that we're going to focus on today. And we have a truly exceptional person who's joining us to help demystify the idea of scaling up today. She is someone who has traveled to more than 25 countries, exploring models of growth and transformation. She's an Italian Forbes 30 under 30 entrepreneur, a speaker, motivational speaker, and has also is also the founder and leading the organization Impact On. We are very privileged to be joined by Meg Pagani. Meg, an absolute honor to have you here at the Disruptive Talks and to have your idea and vision of change and transformation that you're leading on a very large scale with organizations.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor for me to be here speaking with you, especially after such a shared journey around the topic of when something works, actually, how can we make it available for other people, other communities, which ones are the most known and the less known ways. And I'm very honored and very excited to be sharing some of our very nerdy research and work around these topics with you all today. So if it's okay for you, shall I just start with sharing my screen so you can
Yes.
see my presentation? Okay. Everybody should be able to see it now.
Yes.
Can you confirm?
Thank you so much. Yes. Your presentation is on the screen. Yeah. Perfect. Meg, the stage is yours. Yeah.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the kind introduction as well. Thank you, everybody, for those who are listening to this right now or will listen to this in the future. I really wanted to start this presentation and this conversation on scaling impact today, starting with one of the things that I believe we, on a global scale, we somehow landed on agreement for, which is that we want an economy that is planet first, that takes the planet and its interest before anything else. But it's not a secret for anybody to instead know that, of course, we currently have an economy that is very much extractive, so quite far from a planet-first approach. And to me, this really speaks of something that is happening at the moment in terms of change, and some people call it paradigm shifts. And to talk about this, I like to use, as you will see across this presentation, references from the pop culture, for example. So for those of you that are nerdy and nerd like me, you know where the old gods and the new come from. It's from Game of Thrones. And I use this as a metaphor to talk about the old paradigm and the one emerging, and how does this shift work, and why is this so important in the context of, for example, scaling impact, as we're going to see together. Why do I use the word gods, though, considering that many, if not most of the cultures on the planet have a heavy load on this word? Because sometimes we don't realize that, in fact, we have, with our devotion, dedication, and discipline, we become disciples of very specific belief systems and very specific, consequently, economic systems, legal systems, political systems that are rooted in what we actually are devoted to, consciously or unconsciously, as are going to see together. So, for example, the current paradigm that we're operating with when it comes to this willingness to go towards sustainability is one that has, for example, a very specific idea of value. For example, we have a very specific number and value that we can assign to a dead whale, dead and load on a boat somewhere in the world, but not of an alive whale that is in her or his own environment doing what she or he is supposed to be doing to nourish that environment that we actually depend on when it comes to food and so much more. So these type of questions, how is it possible that we know so well the value of one but not the other, is the types of questions that we are confronted today when we talk about impact and sustainability. If this was a hero journey from Campbell, we would be right there at the return moment. After doing so much, after creating so much innovation and ideas of progress, we're sort of having a return moment where we are asked by these times to say, okay, but how did it go? What did we create? How much of this do we actually want to bring forward? Do we want to sustain this the way that it is? And it's funny because when we look at the roots of the way we do things today, we actually encounter the roots in one of the historical periods, and me being Italian, particularly for me, that tends to be considered quite positively. Renaissance, for instance. Around that time, as many of you probably know, it's when we shifted from believing that the Earth was at the center of the universe to discovering that the sun is at the center of our solar system. And what happened, and you're going to see why this is so important, is that like all of a sudden, the universe became this sort of vast land, unknown and unconquered, and all to be explored and conquered with the power of science. So to that macro shift that happened at the time, there was a micro shift where at the same time, so humanism and Renaissance being slightly overlapped with one another, during humanism, we decided that if the universe was so unknown, so vast, so unconquered, and not explored yet, the best and most fit living being that was meant to conquer it all was mankind. And of course, at the time, we were talking about white male most of the time in terms of European-centric beliefs system. But like man-centered belief system, the man is owner of his destiny. The role is to dominate nature. And this specific belief system that we see so much, even today in the world of entrepreneurship, but also, of course, pervaded many other areas. So for instance, if you believe that you're meant to dominate nature, to dominate the wild or the savage, or what is savage to you, you can only imagine how that belief system gets translated when you apply this, calling savage or wild simply a culture that is not yours, or people that have a different belief system or a different color of the skin. What happened in Renaissance was the application of this belief system. That's how we saw application of knowledge, science, the tool to face challenges, and we started to be particularly obsessed about this idea of immediate reward instead of a reward in the afterlife. And the consequences, back to impact and sustainability and eventually scaling, we're seeing them today. And here I'm portraying only the environmental one, while of course there is so much also on the social side that is just as bad, if not more. So what's happening and why is it important to talk about this? Because there is a paradigm shift. We're going from a belief system that says mankind is the center of the universe and must dominate nature, to one that says mankind is part of the universe and must honor nature. There is, again, this idea of reverence, of having to bow our heads to what we have considered for a very long time just not alive materials to exploit, like nature, and instead understanding that not only we are nature, but we are depending on it because it's exactly what allows us to survive. So while many people believe that impact and sustainability, the world of scaling impact is no different, is about the next innovation, the next stretch forward, the next thing that we're going to conquer and discover. What we're experiencing is very much of a return moment where we are asked by these times to revisit the very roots and the very center of why are we doing things in a certain way, and what is it that is in there within that can be changed for this to be different in the future. Which is also why the devotion to the impact that we really care about, because all the causes is right, but I'm sure that every single one of you has experienced that some causes, like for example, education or literacy, some causes move something in us, even if all of them sound logically important, which is why the devotion to our most important impact, if you want, feels more like a remembering than an invention ex novo. And somehow, before continuing and diving a little bit more into, therefore, what does this mean for scaling impact, I wanted to briefly introduce myself so we can have a conversation. And of course, I cannot wait to hear your questions and to know more about who is in the room today. So my full name is Margherita Pagani. I lived abroad for many, many years. So after many adventures and creative interpretations of my name, everybody just calls me Meg. I live in Lisbon, Portugal, although I come from a very small town from in the north of Italy. And my journey as an entrepreneur and an explorer of whatever would call my interest started quite early. You can, in fact, see me here at about 2.5 years when I packed my stuff, went upstairs to my parents and told them that it was time for me to leave because things were not really adding up and I really wanted to figure it out. And I was lucky enough to be born in a family that didn't censor this idea of adventure, didn't censor this desire to go and look on my own terms into the things that would call my interest. Today, most people know me from technology, from scaling impact, as we're going to see together today. And so the general assumption is that I study finance, while instead I studied fine arts. I studied fine arts in Milan and then again in Bilbao. And so the types of numbers and frameworks and codes that trained me were not spreadsheets, but this type of codes. I was trained since very, very early, in very early age, that the stories and literally the streamlines and the codes, visual and archetypical, that we adopt as a culture, and of course, in this case, I'm talking Catholic culture, but any of them will determine how we behavior, how we behave. And this is important in the world because the shift of paradigm that we're experiencing around impact and sustainability is based on very specific stories of who we are, who is a leader, how does a leader behave, what do we need to fear, what do we need to do, what is the role of a woman in these stories, for example, what is the role of someone of color, where do you see them, etc., etc. So you can only imagine that having this variety of interest plus being a professional volleyball player meant for me that when I graduated, this was me in 2011 in Italy. I really had no idea how to somehow find a space where I could express all the interests that I had within me and serve the world of impact in the way that I wanted to. Then luckily enough, 2012 happened, or arrived for me. So for the next 9 years, I have spent literally all my time devoted to research on models of impact, growth, transformation, and scaling. Today in what is almost 30 countries, living and traveling to, about 30 countries in the world. And I started, thanks to these experiences, to see the planet like an organism, and therefore the idea and the need to say, okay, but therefore this interconnectedness nature of our planet and the needs that sustainability and impact are raising make us have the need to really spread what works. So we would expect that what works meaning best practices, programs, or projects that effectively tackle one or more social or environmental challenge would reach 100% of the people or the locations on the planet that somehow need that medicine or that recipe. And when I started to get passionate about this topic, I actually discovered that data show that in fact, even the best impact ventures and the best NGOs, so the biggest one, the most effective, in their lifespan, they only reach 0.5% to 1% of the global demand and need of what they created. In other words, the best projects don't scale enough. And what I wanted to really understand is why does this happen? What are the belief systems behind it? What are the constraints that instead of by design or technical that we can do something about? And this is how somehow I would love to invite you to enter with me today the realm, or what I call the realm of scaling impact, which really is a realm and an area, better said, of this sector, that it's about scaling project or organizations, because it's very different. One is the vehicle that you want to operate with, another one is the program or the activities or the projects that you do. And sometimes these two things get mixed mesh, and we think about scaling historically as an organization, while today and the times where we are right now are instead asking ourselves, how can we scale the impact of the projects, not the organization? We're going to get into that a little bit. The characteristics of what we want to scale or spread, and then the intentions behind. I really, even if the three of these fronts, if you want, are equally important, and I'm happy to address the ones that I'm not addressing now in the questions, I would love to start with characteristics, because I think it's the aspect of scaling impact that the most can shed light of what are the alternative ways to scale impact, why a centralized way is not necessarily the answer, and how we can therefore change our lenses when it comes to scaling impact of whatever that we find is effective. So when we talk about characteristics of projects, we talk about type, depth, and scope. There is 3 macro types of projects on the planet when it comes to impact and sustainability, although this is applicable probably in general. The first one is the type of projects that I call global first. These are apps or softwares where basically you don't need to do anything operationally for someone, for example, to sign up for Slack. I can be anywhere in the world, and Slack as an organization, as a project, doesn't need to do anything for me to sign up and create a new user in another remote location. Very few projects in impact and sustainability are based on apps only, because most of our challenges are actually with people, with the environment, and with behavior. But we do have some solutions that can actually be global first. The second are the models that are hybrid, digital and operational. You can think about Uber, that is not necessarily in the realm of impact, or you can think about those apps that create a local hub in neighborhoods for mothers to swap the clothes of children when they're not fitting anymore. So you reduce waste, but also you create a local community for these mothers to have a support system within their neighborhood, super important from a point of view of mental health. This is something that has an app to coordinate efforts, but really needs operational activities and operational also distribution. So it will need not just the digital aspect to it. And then the third example is, I would say, the majority of the projects that we know in impact and sustainability. These are the projects that are 100% operational. This is an example it's a project from San Francisco. They take buses and they empty them, they refurbish them, and they turn them. These are buses that cannot circulate anymore as buses, but they turn them into mobile hygiene systems or vehicles that can travel around the city and provide access to hygiene, like showers and bathrooms, for example, to homeless people, or to migrants, or to people in need and in poverty. So it's a way to reuse, of course, buses, which means that 100% of this project is operational. They, of course, have a website, but it's very different to coordinate the impact with an app or simply have a website. So these are the three macro types. And when we look at the second and the third, we understand that at some point, when they want to start growing, you can see it here in this scheme, there is impact per beneficiary on the vertical and then reach on the horizontal. When you want to stretch the reach, so reach more people with what you have done, at some point, the quality of the impact decreases. In other words, there is a roof or a maximum size, like an organism or a plant, that this organism has reached for serving the people or the environment in a way that has quality. After, just like a plant, the idea is that it needs to replicate. In this case, scaling impact cannot have just that organization in a centralized way to take care of it all, but it needs to start replicating. And this is when it becomes interesting, because when we start thinking about scaling impact from the perspective of replication or diffusion of knowledge and of what already works, we can see that there is three macro approaches. One is wholly owned, is the one that we were talking about. So I do something, I'm in Mexico, I do something great. The traditional approach is to say, I am going to go to other places or to teach to other people how to do it. This is the model that is the most known, but is not the most effective, because you can imagine not only that if I've done this in Mexico, I'm not necessarily the right person to say to someone in Sri Lanka or in Italy or whatever how to do it, but at the same time, it's extremely time consuming because it goes in sequence and it tries to build everything from a centralized perspective. These are the approaches that get the organizations to only reach 0.5% to 1% of the global need of what they created. Then you have affiliation. This is where you form ongoing partnerships and relationships with others that have a variety of options, from social franchising to licensing to shared knowledge, trainers. There is many options. You can see a few of them here, associations as well, subcontracting. But the point is that even in this approach, most of the time, we have the tendency to go for social franchising. So I did what I did in Mexico, and every person in the world that wants to do the same needs to license from me and replicate from me a very specific way of doing what I've done. This is an example we all know, like Starbucks or McDonald's or any other chain. Like, you enter in one of these places and you could be anywhere. These formulas do not allow the project to really adapt to the local context. And sometimes they become even quite toxic for the local cultures because they impose a certain way of doing things, which is why the softer and more flexible ways of affiliation tend to be the best when it comes to really allowing top-down guidance and bottom-up adoption and adaptation. And then, of course, we have the third one, dissemination. When we have dissemination, we have a sharing of knowledge. Normally, it happens with PDF manuals. The problem with PDF manuals, and this is one of the most successful cases on the planet of it, is that they are quite heavy. So not everybody can learn and study and operate with 153 pages of a document. You lose the trace somehow of what happened to the PDF. But especially we know from behavioral economy that more information does not lead to more action. So while dissemination is very honorable, especially when it comes to open source dissemination, PDF manuals or more information in text does not necessarily lead to more action. So we are at the moment in which we need other approaches, because otherwise, with the incredible amount of talents that are creating models and projects that already work, if they don't get to serve as many people as possible, we have a problem. There is many examples of this. You can see here one social enterprise that uses non-recyclable plastic to build fully fledged houses employing women and young men from vulnerable communities or favelas. This is one project that, of course, cannot scale. It only can diffuse its model and replicate. But for example, if it needed to have a strict formula and it needed to do this in Asia, where plastic is not collected from municipalities, but for example, from waste pickers or in companies, for example, franchising already wouldn't be applied because the formula needs to adapt way more. And this is why when an effective impact project starts to want to spread the PDF manuals or other approaches like this that are more traditional, when scaling means replication, it means that everybody that gets to know about this effective impact project will try to coordinate with that project, creating overheads that normally can even kill the project itself. Because again, if I did this in Mexico or in Argentina or whatever, coordinating with potentially hundreds of people around the world that might or might not be ready to do this becomes very problematic. So we need to go from centralized scaling to decentralized. So in other words, to scale impact better and to somehow answer to the new priority to multiply and localize best practices. This is what we do at impacton.org. This is how we got in touch with Sunita and Mashur in the first place, with the objective to really multiply what works, engaging with originators and turning what they have done in a variety of formats for adopters around the world to use it, build on it, without losing, of course, contact with the originator. We do this in three ways, or combining three elements: communication, technology, and behavior. Communication, because there is a need to synthesize a model, to go from PDFs or instructions to an outcome-oriented guidance that allows adaptation. Because the second is, in fact, turn what is being done into an adaptable format, being able to identify the pillars and the variable of a best practice, and then enable, using technology, multiple autonomous adoption in order to reduce the overhead on the original organization. So really going from replicating to multiplying impact. These are a few of our numbers. I would love eventually to tell you about other examples, but I want to leave more time for questions and Q&A. Some projects focus on food, some others in emotional healing of inmates that have been in jail with dogs. It's an incredible project. Others figure out how to keep kids and youth away from criminal circuits, substituting the adrenaline of being part of a gang with adrenalinic sports as well. And we do this in two ways. On one side, we do trainings, assessment, and synthesis of projects that already work, and the other is spreading with an academy and community and with media projects. That is another thing that we do that is going to come soon. So really, to close this presentation and to open the ground, why do we do this? There is a phrase in Italian, you see it here, that says social impact cannot afford to be just right, to make us feel that we are on the right side of the story, but it must become effective, because the endings are never linear. And as we're seeing at the beginning, the paradigm shifts work in a way where you're sort of, it's like one of those stars. Like you still see the light of the star, but the star doesn't exist anymore. The reason why we see the light is a glitch of physics, but the old way of doing things is already crumbling and is already fading away. So we might want to focus on instead of what do we want to create in its place, remembering and reminding ourselves that we are meant to be pontifex, bridge makers, from what it was to this transition period to what it's going to be or what we would like it to be. Remembering that it's a tale that I consider of power and purpose, because we have, in the history of humanity, three phases of power: access, experimentation, which is where we are right now, and then conscious application. The experimentation is what creates so much extraction from our economy, so much abuse of power, because we wanted to see how far we could go. Now is the time for us to be conscious applicants, conscious devotes of this application of this power, because it's not anymore about accessing those powers, but how we use them. And even if sometimes we might feel extremely overwhelmed, like this scene, again, for those of you that are nerds in Gandalf, remembering that we can still choose to say, I understand why we have done things in a certain way, but I still decide not to respond to you with the same amount of violence and abuse of natural resources or other communities. You shall not pass. And of course, trying in the journey to remember that beauty will save the world. La bellezza salverà il mondo, especially if we will be able to see the beauty in the responsibility and the opportunity to rethink, redefine, and rebuild, and somehow return to new ways and better ways of approaching impact and how we spread impact that is going to be prioritizing the planet and not necessarily ourselves. Thank you very much. I hope you're still there. Mashoud, are you there?
Yes, Meg, absolutely. Thank you for this really powerful presentation, Meg. And I think I'm sure that the people who are watching this live also must have been really triggered to think and kind of really imagine. And I think some of the references that you used are so amazing. I mean, especially for the star and how we get to see the light of the star even when the star has died maybe millions of years ago. So thank you so much for really pushing the limits of our imagination by your presentation here. And I think the question of scale, especially for here at Disruptive Talks, is also very important because we are talking about the idea of like a literacy crisis, which is very large in its scale, and many people, policymakers, change makers, are trying to wrap their head around. I mean, we've had nearly 150 talks, and we have these different ideas, but I think the one big idea that we are still trying to crack is how to make things work at scale. So here, I think what your idea is about, the sense that idea starts and then it becomes decentralized, right? And it can
yeah.
yeah. So would you like to share a bit more about what, when we say decentralization, what becomes the role of the originator of that idea, and what is the relationship between the people who are implementing that idea and the originator in your experience?
It's a very interesting question, because historically, when we look at education, and as I was reflecting in preparation of this session today, for example, the Montessori of the Waldorf methodology came to mind, where someone decoded a very specific methodology and somehow created a name for it, a franchise, and started training other people so they could do it in other places. And I'm sure, though, that if you do Montessori in Argentina, or you do it in India, or you do it in Italy, there is parts that are going to be adapted to every territory. In my experience, everything that gets to that level of spread and empowering, if you want, diffusion, which is not necessarily impositive, tends to have then adaptable nature. I think that when we started with Impact On with this idea of helping more projects to go decentralized, with decentralized scaling, one of the main fears and also barriers that we encountered is really a cultural one, where we tend to come from a story of control, of logic, of saying, if this is what I have done, I'm the only person on the planet to do it, so I need to have control of every single person that does it ever. And with goodwill. I'm not saying that this is wrong or that it shouldn't be the way. It is, at the end of the day, our baby when we create a project like this. But we come now, we learned globalization for all the wrong reasons for about 2 decades now. And now we come, I think, to the realization from a consciousness perspective, collective consciousness perspective, that maybe there are things that are not supposed to be controlled for them to really serve at the level they're supposed to serve. And when it comes to education, when it comes to literacy, when it comes to ways in which we can revolutionize the way that we approach education, that we approach the empowerment of youth, and not just youth, because we have adults as well that have had not access to education, and now they find themselves with an incredible gap, even just from the point of view of using technology in some of these countries, not necessarily just literacy. So when we talk about something as powerful and as life-enabling like education, I think it's particularly important to ask ourselves, okay, scaling or making my organization grow is important, but there is medicine or there is content that I carry that I can put out there in a variety of reasons, so that whoever is close to my territory, I can serve directly, I can serve with my organizations, but then others can carry on. And I think that, to your point and your question on the role of the originator, these type of almost philosophical existential questions, I think, are going to be more and more established in the industry, and not just because I promise you I will try to make it so, but because it's not just me who talks about decentralization. It's not just me who just me or the organizations that work with us that realize that even when they do PDF or when they want to centralize their scaling strategies, there is so many more people that could be using or accessing what they've done than the ones they can reach. So it is becoming more of a shared language. And I do think the pandemic in that sense helped in establishing this idea that we have global challenges, so why do we keep something that is effective and healthy? And then, we can also talk about how do we define what is healthy and effective. But when something is effective and healthy, how can it grow beyond the limits of my own hands or my own organizations? So to me, the originators are fundamentally the guardians of this conversation whenever they understand that they want to put out there in the world something like that. First, because they're the first ones that need to start having these reflections. And I know you and I, Mashur, and Sunita as well, and Monica, we had these conversations about your methodology. But then it comes, of course, a moment in which the originator can decide how much to be involved and how. Sometimes we need to train or we need to develop other muscles to be able to be exposed to people, taking our baby and bringing it on in new ways and not feeling triggered about it, even being enriched about them. So it is really a different muscle. And if you want, it taps into a form of global leadership from the point of what we have created. But of course, the guardians of the intention, the guardians of what it should feel like for someone to benefit from what we have created, I think that's something that still will be very much carried in the hands of the originator and eventually the facilitators like us, and there will be bridge makers in that sense.
Thanks, Meg, for sharing your thought on that. And it's very interesting that how ideas can kind of transform, and by the time they reach a different context and locality. But and often for originators, I'm assuming it must be quite an inspiration. We have like people who feel that their ideas are great, and it might work in a particular context, in maybe for example, be it in a school or in a community, or and it could be these different ideas. But what is, in your experience, what has been, say, a litmus test of a good idea which could also be scalable? How do you talk to the people who come up with these ideas and say that, okay, this is something which might work on scale?
So it's a very interesting question, because normally we don't need to have that conversation. Like, normally when someone has created a recipe, and we call it recipe metaphorically speaking, but when someone created a recipe that is needed somewhere else, normally life takes care of making sure they know. Because they know, if I, for example, we're having a project on access to water, even just by the research, I would understand that there is so many places in the world that could benefit from something that I'm doing effective around water. So we're talking about, of course, everything that is scalable is something that has passed somehow the stage of ideas, right? It must be a project that already encountered actual reality and must have been through the trials and errors and the refinements. So it must already have reached that level where there is a response and a clear impact that can be elaborated in a language that at least is recognizable by the context where they are. But even when it's not something as broad as access to water that is logical, normally what happens is that these projects either win awards or they get showcased or someone talks about them. And I'm not necessarily talking about big broadcasters or anything. Somehow it will start having a mechanism. And it's funny because we learned this with the Impact Club team as we went into the research phase. They all know that there is more people that need what they have done, because they normally would reach out. they would have messages coming through their Facebook if they don't have a website, or through their WhatsApp if they don't have a Facebook, of a sort of word of mouth mechanism. And sometimes this, I remember one client in particular, he would receive, when he came to us, like an average of like 30 messages per week from places that he wouldn't know how the people knew about this. He was not doing marketing. It is just won an award, but it was an award that he was in Argentina, and people were writing to him in English or in Italian or in other languages. And he said, Meg, I barely speak Spanish, because Argentine Spanish is different than traditional Spanish. So it's funny because we don't necessarily need to reform anybody about this. They tend to know. I guess the struggle is when the only reference they have of scaling is the centralized one. So when we had a few conversations with a few entrepreneurs, I remember at some point they really wanted to go for fully franchising or full control, and that's okay. That's okay in the sense of like, we are not interested in reforming anybody. In our experience, someone that is already seeing the opportunity to make their organization grow, but also scale the impact. So these two very different dimensions that can go hand in hand. Because if you allow the impact of what you've done to grow beyond the limits of your direct actions or organizations, it also will feed your organization in one way or another. It will be for notoriety, it will be for collaborations, it will be for whatever. So really stepping into or tapping into a different story of what value creation looks like, and how what reward comes in, like which form. Is it just financial? Is it also knowledge? Is it innovation? Because you're allowing your replicators and adopters and to adapt what you've done and build upon it. So any innovation will come back to you out of enthusiasm and for free eventually. Like, there is so many dimensions that we get to tap into when we allow that type of story to arise when we talk about scaling impact. So I think that, again, as I said before, one of the main barriers is still the cultural one, but we normally don't need to reform people or tell them, hey, this could be done somewhere else. Like, normally the heart that you guys, like any entrepreneur, for impact entrepreneur, for impact worker, because many of these innovations also happen under the flag of like nonprofits, your vocation speaks to you in a way that makes you know that what you have between hands can grow beyond the limits of your own reach. So that at least in my experience is what happens.
Right. It's a very interesting point which you made about how when replicators replicate a project, then they also bring in innovation, which if shared back is something which comes back for free. So much of R&D costs paved off there. That's a very interesting point. We also are getting some comments from the chat. So
I would love to hear them. It's so weird to be a speaker without having an audience. So please, guys, know that I would love to hear you.
Right. So we have a lot of appreciation from some of our speakers, and there's also a question. Okay, so it says that. So, Meg, if you would like to read the question.
Yes, I love this question. There is not a name of who asked the question, but I thank you very much, because it's a very crucial one. So, isn't this the normal dilemma? Oh, can you put it back again? Sorry. Isn't this the normal dilemma for everyone with a good idea? How to scale? People with ideas don't have the scale-up skills. What are the 3 most important actions for scaling up that you can recommend? This is very important because almost always when someone has something that works and they understand that with scaling the traditional way, they would need to become international managers. They understand that it's not what I want. So as you said, this skill set for scaling is very different than being an agent of change in your own territory or in your own community. Even as a social entrepreneur that grows in a big city, to be taking care of scaling in a centralized way, it's a very different job. The skills tend to be similar to the ones that we saw before. So the capacity to look at the model from a design system perspective or systemic design perspective. So to be able to evaluate the if this then that formula. So what created what outcome? What was the must-have elements that must remain the same in every single replication of this, and what instead needs to be adapted? So the capacity not only to map out from a system change perspective this architecture, but also to understand which one of these nodes are pillars that must remain the same and which ones are variables. Then you have a communication skill. Many, of course, entrepreneurs and founders, and I think Sunita is definitely a representation of it, are extremely driven and passionate, so great communicators for what they've done or for what they're doing, and are able to share it with others, but that doesn't necessarily make them trainers that are able to guide someone to take on something that they have done in a specific way and do it in what will feel completely different, because there is so much that needs to be adapted in other places, or might not have the skills to do such guidance. It's almost consultancy. It's very different from like being a social entrepreneur for access to water, completely different skill set. So if I need to set 3 must start from actions for scaling, I would say, to go back to the 3 models that I was mentioning before. So are we talking about something that is fully digital, is a hybrid, or is 100% operational? Because that is the first assessment that anybody can do in terms of, okay, based on what I'm doing, therefore, I can start thinking about scaling in replication, in open source, and not what are the difference. So first, the assessment of what you have between hands. Like, what is the nature of it? How much of it is digital or technological? Is there a patent involved or not? How much of it is behavioral and cultural as well? Like, how much of this can only exist within my culture because we addressed something that honestly, it's configured in a specific way just where we are. So that would be number one, like really to try to build the muscle of the capacity to assess the type of project you have between hands or you have created. The second one is the intentions, as we said at the beginning, like, do I want to scale this? The first type, if I want of intention, and as an organization and as the impact. I know it sounds silly after talking about it so much, but it is triggering when we can or have to choose between, do I lose control of what I'm doing, or do I want to keep in control of what I'm doing? And it is absolutely natural to want it to keep control in the form, for example, of notoriety or credits. Like, we don't want people to necessarily walk away in an open source way. At the same time, if someone has an extremely Spanish name in their organization or their project, it's going to be very unlikely that that's going to be a key asset to maintain when we replicate that in Myanmar, because nobody's going to understand what the name is about. So the credits of who did it might actually need to detach from the title that we give on the project. If we want the project to be the priority, if we win to the project, we want the project to be the thing that grows beyond us. And then the third thing I would say is the intentions behind the scaling per se. So if we just mention it is for credit, or credit and not the organization is a priority, when we zoom in the intention of scaling, we find, do we want this to be a mechanism to the business? Or do we want to prioritize innovation from other countries? So really a community-driven, decentralized network of people that build upon this model and share the findings. Do we want this to be like rich? So we will go for a scaling mechanism that is as light as possible and empowers as many people as possible, organizations, to bring it on without necessarily us wanting to loop back all the knowledge ourselves. And it's not an either or, and there's many more things, of course. Notoriety is one of them. You want to travel and do it in other places while installing a team where you are. Uncountable variables. But to start with the question of what is it that what would feel like true success for me and for what I've created, and how can we discern from that controlling culture that characterizes so many of our, regional cultures and idea of what success looks like, to then discover what is the right, combination of ingredients for a good scaling strategy forward. I would say these 3 are the ones that, in my experience and in our experience, are the most powerful ones to start from.
Right. Thanks, Meg, for answering this question. We'll take another question, but before that, another point which you made about specifically talking about replicating models of education, and you talked about the Montessori kind of an approach. Education has been, globally. I mean, even if you look at even one country or even one city, you will find so much of debate and contradictions in the approaches of how education should be conducted, how, for example, languages should be taught, how math should be taught. So a lot of debate and differences of opinion of how it should be. I wanted to understand your assessment of, when we are talking about scaling of projects in education, and especially when it comes to, the language you're teaching, or the foundational skills. Um, uh, when we kind of replicate it on an international level, are there any examples where you feel that okay, there was a project which was successfully changed? And also with respect to you talked about these projects where there is every project has like a core or like a particular structure,
Like a
which
DNA, yeah.
yeah, like a DNA, exactly. So how do you sense that there, do you think that there needs to be a balance between maintaining that DNA vis-a-vis innovation, and how does it work out in your experiences?
For me, it applies to education as per everything else, which is the core DNA of something, anything, is what effect and value do we want to create. If that remains our compass, it's virtually impossible to start applying that DNA in the wrong ways, because you will or dismantle the DNA altogether. Because if it's the outcome and the value of what we're after, it's going to be very natural for us to figure out what are the things that need to be flexibilizing depending on the culture where we're in. We said before the example of, if the goal is to employ women and youth from vulnerable communities, designing fully fledged houses, so no poverty shelters, using non-recyclable plastic. If that is the outcome, if that is the value, if that's our compass, if you're probably in India, we would go for waste pickers to get the plastic and would work in a specific way to reach that outcome. We will not be fixated that me in Argentina, I've done it creating a circuit of municipalities that will give me the plastic. It's apparently the same thing to impose in India to do the same thing, but the reality is that one, it is embedding the value in the conversation and the context where it wants to install, like genome, like DNA, like gene keys. The other is about how and the structure and the logic and the control. So that's why I talk about, and we talk about, outcome-oriented guidance, which is an extremely nerdy, extremely technical term to run with. But the topic, the meaning is, the goal is not to say to someone, you need to use this pen with your right hand and you need to put it there on the shelf and you need to take it 3 seconds, but to say, in Mexico, I have done this with my right hand and put it on the shelf in 3 seconds and I put it like that. What would you do to bring it there? And someone will use mental powers, and someone will use a foot, or the left hand, and it will take 4 seconds, but the outcome is what we're after. Everything else can be flexibilized. And I know it sounds maybe simplistic because it's very much like common sense, but what they say, common sense is the least common thing on the planet. It does not have an exception in the realm of scaling impact in that sense.
Right, Mike. Thanks for this idea, and I think we have more questions. But, I think we'll take one last question in conclusion. So I'd like to take this question, and maybe Meg, if you'd like to go ahead and
Yes.
answer that.
So would the creation of new social enterprises in an already resource-constrained environment intensify competition for limited resources? I would love to have half an hour just to address this question. Normally, I would say, any conversation that we enter from a, I'm going to be using like words that come from definitely like my background. So please take them like with clams or whatever. Whenever we step into any conversation from a worrisome of resources, a scarcity mindset, that's what we're going to perpetuate. So to me, the question behind what I just read is not, it speaks almost of a fear of stepping into and making trouble or making waves for an already densified environment. And I understand that, because duplication of efforts in communities, it's a real problem. But I would say that the right question to ask is, what I want to do gets in the way, undoes or undo some of the work that has been done there that I consider important? If so, can I instead create a sort of a program where I engage with different actors that already are in the territory to do something that is more than just the sum of the parts? Then maybe can make even more resources available, because optimizes some of the resources of the actors as they use it, or bringing attention for the quality of these sort of bridges that have been built. So really, and I'm not saying that it's not a valid question. Of course, it's a valid question, but sometimes trying to ask, there is an exercise of like trying to ask 5 times why behind anything that we want to do. Why am I concerned about this? For this reason. And why is that? For this reason. And go on and on for why for 5 times. It will bring us eventually to the very essence of our concern. And if the concern is not making waves in a place where we want to innovate, I would ask you, but it's real transformation what you want to create. So that's needed. And if someone can do that and nobody else is doing it, so it's not possible to engage with the local territories, sometimes we tend to forget that while my personal critique to Silicon Valley or the tech environment is that they frame disruption good as per se, we don't talk about in which direction we're disrupting things. In the same way, in the social impact space, sometimes I have this sort of feeling that we all want to be friends and be good with everybody, but many of the ways in which we do impact historically are keeping the problems in place. So if someone wants to step in a way that somehow is more healing and more transformative and more empowering, because it doesn't create those codependencies, doesn't create or perpetuate this, I need to exist as an organization, so I will sort of help this community, but also make myself very needed. If someone wants to step into a space with another more liberating way, and it will be disruptive, then you have my vote.
Right. Meg, it's been really powerful, just and refreshing, just listening to your ideas. And I mean, I think this point really strikes, and I think all those who are watching and will be watching this, they'll really take this back, this idea back, that when we are talking about an idea in the social impact sectors, and we hear, like, for example, many of the stakeholders that come here on the forum are working in education on enhancing learning outcomes and literacy, and talking about these ideas. It's so very important to understand, like, when we are disrupting, it has to be in the right direction. It has to be in a way that after a while that intervention need not be required from maybe an external
not there, maybe somewhere else, or maybe you will have a different phase of your life and you will want to do something completely different. But the making ourselves unnecessary is a very important exercise to be done in impact, because everybody wants to have, of course, a job and make a living, especially of our passions, but we aren't having enough knowledge today to understand when we are acting from a place of control and perpetuation of our own existence, versus which eventually we create a perpetuation of the existence of the issue as well, versus prioritizing the outcomes and the type of scenarios and type of life that we would love to leave behind. And that's a very important exercise, I guess.
Right. Thank you, Meg, once again for sharing your disruptive ideas of transformative change. And we do hope that the ideas that Meg has shared to all those who are joining us live, and who again will be watching this video in the coming time, that these ideas, or these snippets of wisdom which Meg has shared, are we are able to kind of reflect on these questions when we are talking about work in education or foundational literacy and numeracy. And again, if we talk about any problem in India, everything is at a very huge scale,
Exactly.
and now of course it's a global challenge as well with respect to foundational literacy. So thank you, Meg, once again for your time and for your wonderful ideas.
Absolutely, thank you. And I would love to say to anybody that is now live watching this, or anyone that is going to watch this in the future, I know there is always not enough time to address all the questions, but you can find me on Instagram. You can find on my website or email. If you do have questions, if there's things that were not clear, because I'm very nerdy in my presentations and I share a lot of information, or if there is anything that you would love to continue the conversation about, please do reach out. I love to do follow-ups after talks. Sometimes I do also like Instagram lives or things like that to make it more interactive and more accessible. So please do reach out. I would love to hear your questions and support in any way I can.
Thank you, Meg. Really
Thank
wonderful.
you. Thank you very much.